Researchers at the University of Westminster have completed a new study looking at what factors raise injury risk for people cycling in Britain and what might keep them safe. The study, funded by the Road Safety Trust, used an innovative method called a case crossover study. This meant it could look at risk in relation to the amount of cycling and plan infrastructure that can help increase levels of cycling while making sure that each individual cyclist is safer than before.
This study was funded by the Road Safety Trust to look at cycling injury risk. And in this research, we are looking specifically at risk. We're not looking at the amount of injuries alone. And this is important because you might have somewhere where there's a lot of cycling injuries, but you don't know whether that's due to that place being riskier for each cyclist or because there's a lot of cycling. So it's really important in order to talk about road conditions, infrastructure and so on, and how we need to change our roads to make cyclists safer, we need to know about risk. We need to separate out amount of cycling from amount of risk. And the study method that we used does this. We used a case crossover method. So the case crossover method starts with a set of injuries, but then you also have a set of control sites. So the control sites are selected from routes that people were following, or in our case, routes that we modelled, prior to being injured. So you select control sites randomly from people's routes before they were injured. And what the control sites give you is a map of where people might have been injured if everywhere were equally risky, if people were injured purely at random wherever they were cycling. The next step with the method then is to compare those control sites with the injury sites in terms of road characteristics, infrastructure and so on. So for instance, if you have a much higher percentage of sites on main roads among your injury points than your control points, that suggests that main roads may be riskier. But you pull those characteristics into your regression model that you build, which tells you the extent to which each of those factors is responsible for increased or reduced injury risk. This study, like other research, has found that main roads and wider roads are riskier for people cycling. We also found that intersections were riskier, around 3 times riskier than sections of road without an intersection. Again, this is supported by existing research. In a sense, it's not that surprising. Intersections are where you get conflicting movements, where you have the potential for right or left turning motor vehicles to come into conflict with cyclists going straight on, for instance.
When it comes to intersections, the biggest issues is that you have conflicts in the same time and space. So there's going to be like diverging issues, merging issues, turning issues. And so particularly when it comes to cyclists, if you're heading straight ahead, but there's like right turners you have to watch out for with cars and left turners cutting across you, that they're quite difficult. And in some cases, the vehicles find it quite difficult to see cyclists, or perhaps they're not looking out enough because everybody's concentrating on that green light.
The Netherlands is one of the safest countries for people who cycle. How do the Dutch design signalised intersections?
For signalised intersections, the most common design in the Netherlands is what is often called a protected intersection in other countries. And it means that there are separate signals for bicycles. So they arrive at an intersection along a bicycle path and they have their own signal. And most ideally, they also have their own signal phase so that they are not encountering other traffic, for instance, right-turning cars while they go straight on. And there are also the typical design features like a corner refuge island, meaning that drivers have to take a quite tight curve when they turn right, and they have to slow down. Also important is called a setback bike and pedestrian crossing. So there's a distance between the carriageway and the crossing where cyclists and pedestrians are crossing. And this moves cyclists out of the blind spot of lorries that may turn right. And it also gives cyclists more time to anticipate on drivers who may turn right.
When I was at Transport for London, we looked at various different techniques to try and get to a more like a continental standard approach, like looking at protected junctions and hold the left and 2-stage rights and cycle gates. So we've tested many things now. We're starting to home in on the ones that work at the best in certain contexts. So For example, on a massive signalised junction, we find that hold the left works really well, because you can give cyclists lots of green time to go ahead with traffic, but anybody that's turning left across the path of cyclists is held in a different stage in the cycle. There's a really safe technique. And what we're pushing in Greater Manchester at the moment is our kind of Cyclops approach, which is kind of like a circulating cyclist roundabout stage that takes place at the same time as pedestrians are moving, so it's quite efficient, but it means that you're never crossing a junction when cars are turning across your path or trucks.
When we dug a bit deeper into our data, we found that not all intersections were equal. While intersections are generally risky across the board than sections of road without an intersection, we found that roundabouts, including mini roundabouts, were around 3 times riskier than other types of junction. Roundabouts are often introduced in the UK as part of traffic calming measures or to improve road safety, and yet these results suggest that they are actually putting some of the most vulnerable road users, cyclists, at higher risk. So this may be due to the typical design of UK roundabouts, this may be due to driver behaviour, but whatever the reasons, roundabouts are around 3 times riskier for people cycling than other types of junction in the UK.
UK roundabouts are designed to minimise the geometric delay for motor traffic, and they will typically have multi-lane entries. They'll have quite a generous entry radius. They'll have an acute entry angle so that the traffic entering is nearly travelling in the same direction as the traffic on the circulating carriageway, and they will have wide circulating carriageways and the so-called principle of easy exits with a very large exit radius. So on the wide entries of typical UK roundabouts, the cyclists will be to the left-hand side and entering the roundabout at relatively low speed. They'll have to then get up to the same sort of speed as motor traffic on the circulating carriageway. So that's a conflict point. So that's why it's risky for cyclists at the entry. And then similarly, at the exits, where the principle of easy exits has gentle radii for the exit, you will have pretty high speeds for the motor traffic exiting, but cycle traffic might be crossing that exit arm. So it's about differential speed at the conflict points. Roundabouts in the UK can be improved by converting them from the sort of geometry that is typically put in to the geometry of a so-called compact or continental roundabout. So what that will do is constrain the width, create tighter geometry, which will then constrain the speed of motor traffic going through the roundabout. And with lower speed, there will be lower potential for conflict and therefore collision and therefore injury. That's dealing with that within the carriageway. The alternative is to provide a circulating carriageway for cycle traffic outside and around the roundabout.
So we found that high street locations were around 1/3 riskier for people cycling than locations that were not high street locations. So here we're talking about high streets as involving clusters of shops, clusters of retail. These kind of locations are often seen as safer than, say, arterial main roads, and they're not always seen as a problem for people cycling. However, this research suggests that perhaps they should be. They have conflicting movements, they have curbside access, they have a lot of interactions potentially between drivers, cyclists, pedestrians, buses, and so on. There may be different kinds of solutions to consider for different types of high street. So high streets that are more like arterial main roads may require one type of infrastructure solution, whereas high streets that potentially are narrower, more historic and so on, may lend themselves more to pedestrianisation, maintaining cycle access.
Well, in the Netherlands, we started with a sustainable safety vision in the 1990s. And actually, one of the goals of this vision is to arrive at a situation where roads have only one function. And in the case of a high street where there's a lot of shops, so, well, in general, a street where there are a lot of shops, actually these shops and the people getting access to these shops would be ideally, according to sustainable safety, would be the access function. And that means that roads have to be designed according to that access function. If you look at solutions where motor vehicle traffic has really been removed from using a road, and while bicycle traffic is still allowed, I think that the best example in the Netherlands is a pedestrian area, but a pedestrian area where still cyclists are allowed.
In the UK, a big chunk of cycling provision is made up of shared bus and cycle lanes. These often also contain taxis and sometimes motorcycles. The idea of buses and bikes sharing space is seen as odd in many other European countries, but it's become normal in the UK, partly because it's relatively easy to share bus and bike lanes as opposed to building new infrastructure. But what impact does it have on people cycling? So this study found that looking across Britain, having bus lanes almost doubled the risk of injury, even when we were controlling for road class, road width and so on. So this is a slightly different finding to our earlier London study, where we found that bus lanes were associated with a slight improvement of safety for people cycling. So maybe this is due to the fact that bus lanes in London are operational for different hours, they have different characteristics, enforcement is different and so on. So more research is needed, but I think what is clear is that bus lanes have not done the job in terms of cycling provision. And indeed, looking across the country, they seem to be putting people cycling at greater risk rather than protecting them.
Yeah, I think the change from like bus lanes being viewed as part of the cycling infrastructure kit to them being viewed separately all comes down to it's that feeling of safety. When people are cycling in and around buses and you're often interchanging positions, these are massive objects, multi-tons, they can go at quite a speed and it can be really intimidating, particularly for new cyclists. So as we're trying to get more and more people to consider cyclists and like take it on some of the main roads, if we're relying on bus infrastructure and bus lanes, it doesn't seem to be enticing enough. And people want to see something that's there for them. They want to see their own dedicated space.
In this study, we were able to include cycle infrastructure, which we identified through manual coding of Google Street View lookups at the different locations. Most of the infrastructure could most kindly be described as legacy in relation to current design standards, so it's worth remembering this when interpreting the results. We coded the infrastructure into two different types. So one type we called bike lanes. So bike lanes were defined as being painted on-road infrastructure without physical separation from motor vehicles. These lanes could be mandatory, which means that drivers are not meant to use them, or they could be advisory, which means that you're allowed to drive in them just as much as you're allowed to cycle in them. Most of them were advisory, often they were narrow. Now we found that the presence of these lanes was associated with an increase in risk for people cycling, around 50% riskier. Similar findings also came from a study that looked specifically at London in relation to advisory cycle lanes. So it seems that painted infrastructure, while it's very common across Britain, doesn't seem to be keeping cyclists safer and may in fact be putting them at higher risk.
Why is this? There is some other evidence that the presence of marked cycle lanes can encourage drivers to feel they can pass cyclists more closely than if there was no lane marking.
We instrumented a bicycle with an ultrasonic distance meter and video cameras. We cycled a metre from the curb in conditions with a cycle lane and without, in 20, 30 and 40 mile an hour areas in many various locations in different cities in the north of England. And what we found from that research was that not untypically, when a cycle lane line was painted, drivers in fact did drive closer to the cyclist than when there wasn't cycle lane painted. And we think that this is probably because the drivers, when there is a cycle lane line, will drive up to the line either side of them, the centre line and the cycle lane line, without particularly due recognition of whether or not there's a cyclist in the cycle lane. And if the width is inappropriate, then in fact the passing distance to the cyclist may not be as large as it would have been had the driver had to perform an overtaking manoeuvre of the cyclist within one single lane. I think advisory cycle lanes and white paint in the road is still useful, but it has to be in the right context. I think the flows have to be not too high, the speeds need to be relatively limited.
study, we found that painted cycle lanes increased risk. We also looked at infrastructure with some level of separation from motor traffic. We found that this kind of infrastructure, which we called cycle tracks for brevity, although mostly we're talking about shared footways, this kind of infrastructure didn't increase risk considering the data as a whole, but neither did it reduce it. When we separated out the intersection and the non-intersection locations, we found trends in different directions. So away from intersections, there was a trend towards reduced risk, which didn't reach statistical significance, and at the intersections, we found a trend for increased risk. So as with the lanes studied, much of this infrastructure was largely poor quality. We're talking mostly about footways turned into shared space for walking, cycling. Generally, there's a lack of protection at junctions and generally often flared entrances to side roads, for instance. By contrast, a study in London where we looked at different types of protected infrastructure, we found that curb separated and stepped tracks had a strong protective effect.
So the three main categories that we looked at in terms of cycle tracks were curb separated. So these are cycle tracks that are separated by continuous or near continuous physical upstand, usually separated by verges or curbs. Then you have stepped cycle tracks. So these are again vertically separated, but also at a different level to the main highway. And then finally you have the light separated cycle tracks, and these are protected by intermittent objects, normally kind of planters or bollards. So our study found that curb separated cycle infrastructure reduced injury odds by around 40% compared to no infrastructure. We also found that step tracks were even more protective and reduced injury odds by 65% compared to no infrastructure. But because they are less prevalent, there was a bigger confidence interval there. Mandatory cycle lanes were found to be insignificant. Then advisory cycle lanes were interestingly found to increase risk by around 30% compared to no infrastructure, which I think to begin with seems kind of counterintuitive. But when you look at kind of some of the existing advisory lanes that are in London, you can kind of see why that actually might be the case. And indeed, some of those advisory lanes will probably not pass TfL's new quality criteria.
So I think the findings of this, along with the findings of our main study, suggest that cycle infrastructure as it currently exists across Britain is not protecting cyclists, but that it is possible to do so with higher quality infrastructure, such as that has been built in London more recently. We know that car-dominated environments are generally worse for people walking or cycling. This study specifically found that where there are car parks or petrol stations, risk is increased by around 40% for people cycling. At these sites, there are typically a lot of turning movements into or out of the car park or the petrol station, and typically the kind of design that we have in the UK prioritises these turning movements over people walking or cycling. So these findings suggest that we need specific mitigations for these kinds of sites to keep people cycling safe, and that if such sites are proposed, planners should think very carefully about the safety implications and the kind of mitigations that might be needed to reduce risk.
I think anywhere where cars have to pull across the path of cyclists and get into a car park or a petrol station, you've got to be looking at treating it like it's a crossover. So they should feel like they're cutting across the footway. That will really slow people down, because that's effectively what they are doing. And we have to worry about pedestrians as well. So the more it can be treated in that kind of continuous way, the more we should see the behaviour of drivers slowing right down, having a look everywhere, going, oh, nobody's even stopping for me. All that stuff's keeping everybody else safe, and then it should be slowly merging into these areas and back out again. So I think there's a lot we can do by just making the entrances look a lot more like crossovers and not like side roads that you just turn in and out of whenever you see fit.
The research was able to incorporate the impacts of on-street car parking. So this is quite unusual. We did it through using Google Street View image lookups. It wasn't perfect because the Google Street View car tends to go around off-peak and our study focuses on peak, but we think it gives some kind of a measure of car parking prevalence. So the results were mixed depending on whether we matched our controls by intersection status or not. When we didn't match, we found that the presence of parked cars increased injury risk for people cycling. When we matched, we found that the effect disappeared, but it still led to a reduction in the protective effect of residential streets. So it does seem like there is something going on there.
The reason that parked cars make such a big difference is that people have to ride between moving cars and parked cars. And the parked cars have two problems. One is that they move across the bike area to park and to get out of parking. And they also, the driver may be opening their door and the bicyclist may hit that open door or be hit by the opening door. And that's a huge extra risk. We found that about 1/10 of the injuries were caused by doorings. One great thing that can be done on streets that do have parked cars is simply to remove the car parking.
Our earlier study in London had found that 20-mile-an-hour streets were safer than 30-mile-an-hour streets for people cycling. So we looked at the same thing in this study, and we found that when we just did the univariate modelling, i.e. we just looked at speed limits, we didn't put anything else into the model, we found a similar result. So we found that with the univariate modelling, injury odds were around 1/3 higher for 30-mile-an-hour limit streets compared to 20-mile-an-hour limit streets. What we did find this time, though, was that when we put the other factors into the model, like for instance road width, the independent impact of speed limits disappeared. So what we're finding here in this study is that 20-mile-an-hour streets were safer, but that this was dependent on factors like road width, probably to keep speeds actually low.
Following a 2010 pilot, in 2014 and 2015, Bristol introduced a citywide 20 miles per hour policy, with only a few roads accepted. The University of the West of England carried out an evaluation of the scheme, finding a city-level reduction in injuries.
The initiative in Bristol offered a unique opportunity because it was citywide across 7 areas, introduced over a period of time. So it was a very good natural experiment. It was signed speed limits with no physical measures. But we did see a statistically significant reduction in fatalities. The net result of that is pointing in the direction that the 20-mile-an-hour speed limit created a reduction in collisions and injuries. If we look into the dim and distant past, there's no logical reason why the speed in urban areas is in fact 30 miles an hour. And if we knew now what we knew when speed limits were first introduced, I'm pretty certain that we would have introduced 20-mile-an-hour speed limits as opposed to 30-mile-an-hour speed limits in urban areas.
In the UK, pedestrian guard railings are a common feature of many town and city centres, even in London, where Transport for London has led a programme to remove them. So guard railings are supposed to reduce risky crossing behaviour by pedestrians. They physically block their path away from designated crossings. However, cycling advocates have long been concerned about the impact of these on people cycling, that people might get trapped between guard railing and a lorry, say, and not have somewhere to go if something threatens them on the road. But there might potentially be a broader issue, as raised by Transport for London guard railing study, which is that potentially guard railings give drivers a signal that there won't be any pedestrians in the way and therefore may encourage higher speeds, may encourage inattention. In this study, we found that the presence of pedestrian guard railing raised the injury odds for people cycling by around 20%.
So I think the guard railing, when we see a guard rail, in a way it can encourage maybe parents to think that their child's going to be safe because there's something containing them onto the footway. But the reality is, we know that when you put in guard railing, the speeds of motor traffic actually rise because the drivers also feel like nobody is going to step in front of them. out of the blue, you know, as they're driving down the road, they're comfortable that they can just keep going without a pedestrian crossing.
Well, yeah, London's tried to remove guardrailing for the simple reason that when we did try removing it, the collisions reduced dramatically, and there's evidence from Transport for London of a 56% drop in collisions over multiple years. Albeit outside London, we've still got a case to win. There's still guardrail going in left, right and centre across the UK, and I'd remove it all.
Like many studies, we found a safety in numbers effect, which is that the more cyclists there were on a road segment, the safer each individual cyclist was. So this is separate from infrastructure effects that we looked at, although of course it's worth mentioning that there could be factors we're not measuring related to infrastructure, or there could be factors that we're not measuring accurately enough, like for instance the fact that our grading of cycle infrastructure quality is limited, or the fact that we don't know whether there were actually parked cars present at the location at that time. But assuming that safety in numbers is additional to infrastructure benefits, as some other studies suggest, there might be different explanations for this. So some people think it's due to wider cultural changes. So if you've got more cyclists in an area, in a city, even in a country, then you may have more drivers that cycle, you may have more drivers who know someone who cycles, and that may change their behaviour, change their attitude to people cycling. Or maybe the salience is even more local than that. So perhaps drivers get used to interacting with cyclists on a particular route, and they get used to looking out for cyclists on that route. Or more pessimistically, it could just be that more cyclists on a route means that if a driver makes a mistake and hits someone, there's more chance that the cyclist that they hit isn't you.
So how can we get many more people cycling to benefit from those safety in numbers effects?
I've been involved in the evaluation of the Cycling Cities and Towns programme. This involved investing a large amount of money in boosting cycling levels in 8 cities across England. And what we found was the schemes that had really large effects were those that did really high quality infrastructure, so fully segregated, protected cycle lanes, or even lanes completely away from traffic, like on a towpath. Those ones saw a huge increase in cycling. By contrast, where people did less ambitious things, for example, only painted cycle lanes, we saw much less effect. So one of the lessons we took from that was if you want to achieve big cycling, you need to build high quality things. And actually doing that is more effective, because then you can build it once and build it right, rather than having to go back a few years later to improve it.